ask colleagues to come to the front seat so that we don't feel too alone here when the speakers will come on the stage. There are some empty seats here, please. Thank you so much. Great, thank you. All right, welcome everyone to our event today. I'm Mahin Khan. I'm Senior Climate Advisor for WWF Netherlands, and I lead the adaptation stream for WWF globally. And today we are going to discuss about adaptation in nationally determined contributions in the context of Africa and how we can take those lessons learned forwards. I think we are seeing a very much needed and important elevation in climate adaptation needs and action. I suppose I do not have to repeat a few things that we all know here, and that is that various studies, research, and most importantly, lived experiences of people in countries in Africa, what they're experiencing in terms of the unfolding impacts of climate change. However, we think that we can't work in silos anymore, and the national policy instruments such as nationally determined contributions and national adaptation plans, which are due next year in 2025, need to be aligned and integrated for purposes of coherence, efficiency, and also to avoid duplication of resources. As a result, today we will be discussing a lot of points based on this topic. We have a few objectives for this event, which I want to highlight so that we all know what we're stepping into. We want to share practical recommendations on how to escalate more tangible and transformative adaptation actions in Africa, in line with crucial priorities such as gender consideration, and to provide a platform to advocate and pledge for higher adaptation narratives and actions at COP29, including cross-collaboration to deliver the NDC agenda in Africa. We have recently developed a briefing paper in WWF on how to strengthen adaptation components in nationally determined contributions by analyzing 19 countries in Africa where WWF is currently present. We will discuss this more in detail in our panel today. So our agenda for the next 1 hour is we will start with a keynote from Jessica Troney, who is the head of Climate Change Adaptation Unit. She's also the Adaptation Portfolio Manager, Adaptation Resilience Branch Climate Change Division in UNEP Africa. After which we will move to a panel discussion followed by an interactive session. Jessica, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Nice to see you all. I hope it's a good first day of COP. I know yesterday was the first day, but today really is the first day. So I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Jessica Troney. I work for UNEP, based in Nairobi. I've been working for UNEP for the last 8 years, and I head the Adaptation Unit. So I was asked to give a few words on the Adaptation Gap Report, and then I'll give you a few thoughts about how to elevate adaptation in the NDCs. So I'm juggling a little bit with things. Okay. So just a little bit about UNEP. We're an intergovernmental organisation, universal membership. All 193 countries in the world are members of UNEP, and the Climate Change Division was recently established in February, so we're in the Climate Change Division. We've been working as an organisation on adaptation since about 15 years ago, and we're supporting our member states, about 50 plus of them, with about $500 million worth of grant financing, accessed majorly from the international climate funds, but also some bilateral funding. And we also produce normative products. One of our flagship reports is the Adaptation Gap Report. That is not meant to be blank, but something's happened with the visual. And I'm sure that you've heard of these publications. But we also produce many more briefing notes, policy guidelines and so on, based on our program work and program experience. So to the Adaptation Gap Report, these are just some of the key messages, but well, the first one comes from the Emissions Gap Report, which was launched 2 weeks ago. Current global warming predictions suggest a rise of 2.6 to 3.1 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. The range is represented by 3.1 is on current trajectory, current policies. 2.6 is the commitments contained in the NDCs. But you'll note that even with the commitments in the NDCs, we're still headed for a much higher level of climate change than the scientists predict is within safe limits. Second point to note is that adaptation finance for developing nations grew from 22 billion to 28 billion, according to OECD data, but it's still far below the estimated needs of $215 to $387 billion per year. And even if we were to double the 2019 level, as was agreed in Glasgow, we would only still reach 5% of projected needs. So we still have a very long way to go. And of course, developing countries are suffering from increased debt levels. They struggle with climate change impacts, and on this continent we've seen quite a few this year, highlighting the need for urgent finance and scale up. So in terms of planning and implementation, 171 countries globally have an adaptation policy, strategy or plan. Just over half have a second instrument, and 20% have a third. 16 of the 26 countries without a national planning instrument are developing one, but 10 countries show no indication of developing such an instrument, 7 of which rank highly on the Fragile States Index, indicating, of course, that the countries that are the most fragile are probably the countries in need of humanitarian aid. However, they also need adaptation planning, of course, so there's work to do there. Implementation faces obstacles including regulatory, financial and capacity challenges, we know that. And to achieve meaningful adaptation, financing must shift from reactive, project-based efforts to strategic, transformative efforts. And I'd be interested to know from the audience what you think those would be. Also, something I picked up from the main report, the relationship between NDCs and NAPs. And an interesting finding that 68% of NDCs are not aligned with NAPs. So really there's work to be done even there in terms of aligning what national adaptation planning findings are and what's actually reflected in NDCs. But essentially the difference is NDCs are statements of commitments. They state the goal and the means to get there, whereas the adaptation planning processes are processes intended to generate inclusivity and the evidence base. Then on unlocking adaptation finance, interesting finding that most of the action to unlock adaptation finance does in fact stem from the public sector. If you think about the incentives, the regulations, the blended finance, the de-risking approaches, that needs to be initiated by the government. And obviously then also think about non-market goods and services, coastal protection being one, early warning systems being another, all of those social, non-market goods and services that the public sector can most comfortably provide. However, a third of public adaptation finance could come from the private sector. It is in sectors that generate commercial returns. Agriculture, water infrastructure, but again, it needs that enabling environment. There are many emerging financial tools, such as resilience bonds, climate risk insurance, offering promising avenues, but they're very much pilot projects. They need to be scaled up. And so the importance of public sector actions to set the frameworks, to set the enabling actions can't be overstated. And interesting, and this could be one of the strands for raising adaptation finance. According to the latest available data, debt interest payments in developing countries, excluding China, were larger than the estimated adaptation finance needs, which points the way to debt forgiveness and linking of that debt forgiveness to adaptation actions being a key prong moving forwards. So these next three slides are my ideas for how we could elevate adaptation NDCs. The first one is to look for adaptation and mitigation win-wins. And on the continent, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, land-based emissions are the major emitter. When you think about agriculture, land clearing for agriculture, for urban expansion, use of biomass energy. Just some interesting stats here from the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report. 850 million people in Africa rely on wood, fuel and charcoal for cooking. That's a lot of people, and that is the majority of the population on this continent. Which continent are we? On the African continent. While 548 million live without access to electricity. So these are appalling statistics for 2024. In terms of projections, Africa is going to undergo the major urbanization trend globally. And currently, cities account for 38% of emissions, and that's going to grow. Transport sector emissions are also set to increase. So in terms of adaptation options that also deliver emissions reductions, we're talking about investing in land restoration, investing in soils, investing in nature-based solutions in cities that offer flood control and cooling benefits. So for example, green roofs, urban forests, sustainable drainage systems, even food allotments where food security is an issue. And then looking at low-emission agriculture in the rice sector, clean energy solutions, clean cooking, really important for the continent, electric mobility can all reduce emissions while enhancing resilience. Then I would say another thing to do better is to assess the co-benefits of adaptation, because a lot of adaptation is going to deliver the SDG gains that we're looking for. Things like public health benefits from food and water security while reducing indoor pollution from biomass energy cooking. Investing in adaptation promotes gender equity, sustainable development, emissions reductions, reduced loss and damage, and basically a whole raft of SDGs. And lastly, I would say that we need to do much better about reflecting loss and damage in NDCs as the no adaptation or low adaptation scenario. This is what's happening today. And just in 2023, this is what we can say have been the really high impact events on the continent. Floods across West and Central Africa affecting millions of people with substantial loss of life and displacement. The frequency and intensity of floods in the region are worsened by climate change, with some areas experiencing annual severe floods. Floods of this magnitude could occur every 3 to 10 years. So the return periods for these very severe floods is shortening. In Sudan, it's a semi-arid, arid country. Severe floods due to unprecedented rain between June and August this year. Attribution analysis has shown that rainfall intensity increased by 18% since 2018. And in South Sudan, 4.1 million people in 43 counties have been affected, with 379,000 people displaced. A cascading impact from that is health impacts, including malaria, surging in flood-prone areas. These are the sorts of facts and figures that need to be in country NDCs so that it becomes very obvious about the cost benefits, if you like, of investing in adaptation and how that would be good for the SDG agenda and for people and livelihoods and homes and so on in Africa. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica, for setting the scene, and we will come back to your question about transformative adaptation action in the Q&A section. Okay, so we will move on to the panel session now. Sorry, it's a bit difficult to juggle so many things with a microphone, so please bear with us. We have four speakers today for the panel, and they're from diverse backgrounds. So I will invite you and to come and join me on the stage, and I'll start with Alice Nchare. I will ask you to introduce yourself as I give you the mic, if that's okay, please, wherever you want. Walter Stabua, Amanda McKee, and Aminat Adebayo. Thank you for joining me, everyone. So Alice is, will you introduce yourself and then pass on the mic, and then we have to get the mic back to me so that I can start the question session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. My name is Alice Share, and I'm the technical assistant for the WWF Africa Adaptation Hub.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Walter Stubwa. I lead the Regional Collaboration Center for West and Central Africa of the UNFCCC.
Good afternoon. My name is Amanda McKee. I'm the Director for Knowledge and Learning with the NDC Partnership Support Unit.
Good afternoon. My name is Aminat, and I am the NDC Outreach Coordinator at Care About Climate. I'm also a researcher working at the intersection of climate change, food security, and women's health. Thank you.
That went smoothly, thank you. Thank you very much for joining us in the discussion today. And so I would like to start with Alice, because one of the reasons we are also doing this event is because we have recently written a paper on adaptation in the NDCs with a focus on countries in Africa. Can I ask you to share some key highlights from the paper and maybe some insights from your end as you were analyzing the 19 countries?
Thank you very much, Mayin. So maybe before starting, it's important to highlight the objective of why we actually developed this policy brief. As we all know, Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents in the world to climate change, despite the fact that we are among the least polluters. So for this reason, it's very important for us to have robust and strong and ambitious NDCs with a focus on adaptation components. So that's why we decided to actually have this policy brief to develop it. So the focus was on 19 countries where WWF has a presence in terms of country offices and partner offices in Africa, covering southern, eastern, and northern African countries, and some Western African countries as well. And so the analysis in this analysis, we focus on 9 key criteria on adaptation, which we believe are the key components or the key criteria that are actually going to help countries to have strong, robust, and ambitious NDCs. And these criteria include climate vulnerability assessment, availability of climate-smart adaptation actions or strategies, alignment of the NDCs with the national adaptation plans, existence of locally led adaptation actions, institutional and technical capacity, adaptation finance and partnerships, and last but not least, monitoring and evaluation. So our analysis were actually focused on these 9 criteria. We wanted to see how far the NDCs, the adaptation components of the NDCs take into account this, address these 9 criteria. So based on the analysis, we realized that 7 out of the 19 countries met at least 7 of the out of the 9 criteria, and these countries were Cameroon, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Madagascar, Rwanda, Tunisia, and Uganda. And a country that particularly stood out from this analysis was Rwanda. And the analysis was, the adaptation component of Rwanda was actually very, very interesting because they had this very special way of highlighting the key components of these 9 criteria. And maybe just to conclude, we had key findings from this analysis that led us to make a number of key reflections. The first one was that these 9 criteria actually could serve as a tool, not just for African countries, but for other nations as well, to be able to, have robust and ambitious NDCs. And then the second one, we realized that some countries actually perform poorly when it comes to 3 criteria, including locally led adaptation, monitoring and evaluation, and the alignment with national adaptation plans. So for us, we thought that it would be really very important to enhance that, especially as we are moving towards the NDCs 3.0, the next round of NDCs starting in 2025. So that's it. And then there is also another thing on maladaptation practices. We realized that most of the countries did not really take into account measures to address maladaptation practices. So as we all know, maladaptation happens when we are implementing actions that are instead increasing vulnerability instead of reducing the vulnerability. So in the analysis, we didn't actually see how far some of these countries have actually put on actions to avoid these maladaptation practices. And our key recommendation is to ensure that for future NDCs, this is actually addressed. And the fourth point is the alignment with the UAE framework for global climate resilience. As we know, the next round of NDCs is going to be like the first after the conclusion of the global stocktake and the UAE framework for global climate resilience. So it's really an opportunity for us to step up our ambitions when it comes to adaptation and see how we can align our adaptation efforts with the global climate resilience framework goals and targets. And last but not least, and this is also building upon a study that was conducted by the AFDB in 2019, we realized that most adaptation components of the NDCs in Africa describe their needs mainly qualitatively, and they really lack specific details when it comes to the number of projects, the target beneficiaries and the financial resources needed. So one of our key recommendations actually see how countries can build upon that as we are revising the next phase of the NDCs in 2025. So thank you very much. I'll stop here for now. Back to you.
Thank you, Alice. And I think that reflection of ours about the lack of effective alignment with the national adaptation plans goes quite well with what just Jessica had presented on the UNEP report as well. Now I would like to move to Walters. So my question to you is, what role does the RCC play in pushing the NDC agenda in Africa? And how do you see the level of adaptation commitments so far? And what gaps and actions are needed to upgrade these commitments? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon once more. I want to commend you for the composition of your panel. I really like the fact that you went very strongly for a strong gender focus. I appreciate that, especially when it comes to discussing these issues on focusing on Africa. So let me take a step back. So we are talking about a year when we just came out of the global stocktake, as our colleague just mentioned, and one of the key findings that came out when it comes to adaptation is the fact that out of our 54 African countries, we only have about 21 of them that have submitted national adaptation plans. Let's forget about the number and the documents that are going to be on the table, right? We're talking about the process itself. The important thing is not just having the document, it is the process that you undergo to be able to get to that document. It is a national process where there is a lot of bottom-up, a lot of stakeholder involvement, and that process of getting to it helps you to be able to assess the vulnerability of different sectors in your country. different groups of people, different regions in your country, and all of that. That tells the international community that you understand the needs of your country. You can be able to go out there. You're ready. You've done your homework. And that is what attracts financing. If someone is going to come to Africa and be looking around and saying, where do I put my money when it comes to adaptation? That is exactly where they start. Have you done your own homework as a country before? If you haven't done that, it becomes very difficult for them to be able to say, okay, you understand your adaptation needs. So the RCCs are actually on the ground trying to make sure that we encourage countries to formulate national adaptation plans that respond to their needs. But let's not be naive. The challenges are there and they're very obvious. Countries are struggling with accessing the data that they need to be able to develop these national adaptation plans. They're struggling to access the finance that they need to be able to develop national adaptation plans. They're also struggling with the technical capacity. We're talking about in some instances where you have to undergo like modeling to be able to know what the projected impacts for your country would be in 10, 15, 20 years, and you need to respond to this in your national adaptation plans. So what we are doing is, as the RCC, which is an extension of the UNFCCC Secretariat, we're organizing workshops where we're building capacities of countries, we're helping countries matchmake, we're pointing them to where the data is existing for countries that are struggling, and we're also trying to understand who is out there and doing what, because we know that there's a lot that is ongoing, and we're trying to avoid a situation where there is duplication of effort. So if WWF is already leading on a certain area of work, the RCC is doing a mapping of stakeholders and can then point countries to say, you know what, instead of coming and starting all over from scratch, maybe you can already look to to WWF, or you can look to GIZ, who is already leading in this area of work. WMO already has some data that could be able to inform your work that you're trying to start and all of that. So the RCC is really there not to replace or compete with any entity that is already existing on the ground, but to understand where there are already actors undertaking work, and we try to match them to where the needs are. When it comes to the actual content of the NDCs, we are also organizing events. We have quarterly events where we invite both UN and non-UN entities on a quarterly basis to have this coordination, and this is again going in the same direction of saying who is doing what. And then once we have those coordination meetings amongst those who are support providers, then we invite all the countries in Africa to join them at the table and listen to what is AFDB already doing something. Do they have a climate action funding window that you can be able to apply to? So we help with the facilitation of, even when it comes to drafting concept notes, we're also saying, can we help you draft the concept notes that tick the boxes for you to be able to access the finance that you need? And this does not end at the level of formulating the documents. It also ends at the level of transforming those documents from documents themselves with ideas to actual projects. So we're also saying, what sectors have you prioritized? How can we help you? So we have occasionally organized something we call NAP writing workshops, but that comes with an extension of really moving you beyond just drafting documents, but also formulating the concept notes that will be able to be accepted by the funding agencies like the GCF and the JEF and so on and so forth. I'll stop here, but happy to take follow-up questions at any point. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Walters. I'll move on to Amanda now. So Amanda, my question to you is, could you please tell us more about how the NDC partnership is engaging on the ground in countries in Africa? Which level are you investing in adaptation from that angle? And any gaps, challenges that you would like to highlight in that context? Thank you.
Great, thank you. And just recognizing all of the comments from speakers before, because I think it really nicely lays the ground for where the NDC partnership is coming in. So we work to support countries to plan and to implement ambitious and achievable NDCs. And part of this work includes focus on mitigation, but also adaptation as well. I wanted to give a little bit of context first in terms of what countries are requesting on adaptation, and specifically in the African continent. So currently we have just under 100 member countries, developing countries, who are requesting support through the NDC partnership. And 65 of those countries are requesting adaptation-specific support. So I wanted to just start with that number, because often when we talk about NDCs, the first thing that comes to mind is mitigation, but most countries are thinking about adaptation in terms of the support needs that they have. If we look at Africa specifically, we have 40 African member countries, and 32 of those are requesting support on adaptation. So the percentage is even higher, which I think is no surprise to anyone here. The other statistic I wanted to start with is in terms of the support that's coming to countries. Because currently 50% of these requests, these adaptation requests in Africa, remain unmet. So there's really a significant need for increased financial and technical support for the needs that countries are expressing to plan and to implement their NDCs. So just to give you a sense of what some of those requests look like, the most frequently requested sectors for adaptation support in Africa are agriculture, water, forestry, and land use. But there's also an increasing demand for requests around nature-based solutions, particularly in sectors like fisheries, coastal management, but also urban infrastructure. A few of the key topics that we see where countries are really requesting support is, first of all, on mobilizing finance. So access to adaptation financing remains a significant barrier, and Jessica presented some really stark figures at the beginning of this session. But this is something that countries are coming forward to the partnership with requests for support on. And this includes preparing bankable projects. This continues to be one of the most frequent but least supported types of requests that we receive through the partnership. So we really welcome the type of engagement that the RCCs are doing, for instance, working with countries to build up capacity on this. The last topic I wanted to highlight around country needs on the continent is really around capacity building. And some of the things that we see are capacity around monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So the systems to actually track progress on national adaptation goals, to understand resource allocation, and to understand the effectiveness of different interventions. So if we look ahead to, well, the year ahead, where countries are preparing NDCs 3.0, one of the things that we came to the realization quite quickly is that there's a lot of resources and there's a lot of guidance out there on how to do this properly, but it can be quite overwhelming for a country looking to understand what the opportunities available to them are and how to tailor that to their specific needs and national circumstances. And so working together with the UNFCCC Secretariat and engaging more than 30 of our technical partners, we developed something called the NDC 3.0 Navigator. And the idea here is to present a series of what we call routes or pathways that countries can think about in how to implement the outcomes from the global stocktake, but target them to their own national circumstances. And these routes focus on ways that countries can raise their ambition, so both through mitigation but also adaptation. We also focus really heavily on just transition as a way to increase ambition. And then equally, the Navigator provides guidance on how to go about implementing those targets. So the things that need to be put in place to implement. So whole of government, whole of society, technically sound documents, access to finance. The last thing I wanted to mention is because we actually noticed quite a big gap in terms of adaptation and how you really take the global stocktake outcomes and apply them at a national level. And so these past months, we've actually been working, or we've convened an expert working group made up of partners and researchers who have been developing guidance for countries on opportunities for inclusion of adaptation in NDCs 3.0 specifically. And so we've clustered the recommendations in the report into three categories. And I won't go into this in detail because actually all of the needs that we heard from previous speakers are reflected here, which was great to see. But the three clusters that we're suggesting and helping countries to work on, first of all, is on raising ambition. And so through transformational adaptation and climate resilient development, this can include support in developing plausible climate scenarios, setting adaptation-aligned and measurable targets, integrating adaptation into development, and really understanding the co-benefits that come along with that. We're also encouraging countries to think about how to accelerate implementation. And some of the things, or some of the guidance that we've put together is on aligning targets with NAPs. The number that Jessica presented was really striking in terms of the misalignment, and this is a really big opportunity for countries as they're working on the NDC 3.0. But also strengthening all of the stages of the adaptation policy cycle, so all the way from the gathering, understanding the knowledge, to the monitoring and the evaluation and the learning. And then lastly, really encouraging countries as they're developing their NDCs 3.0 to think about how they need to strengthen the enabling conditions to implement that, both at the global and the national level. So this can be through enhanced capacity building, but also, and probably most importantly, all of the work that needs to go into unlocking adaptation finance.
Thank you, Amanda, for answering that question so well. I've taken a lot of notes, and I have a lot of questions, but I don't know if we have sufficient time. Yeah, we can already see the alignments coming from the different speakers. And I think that it's important we are having this discussion at this moment of time, given that next year is 2025, and we are 5 years away from the goals that we have set, and also that there is an opportunity for alignment in NDC and NAPs. I would come back to a very basic questions perhaps at the end, that why are we specifically talking about adaptation in NDCs? Because of what's written in the Paris Agreement and how these policy instruments are meant to be sort of developed, and how we are progressing from there. So I'll come back to that question later for all the speakers here. But now let me move on to Aminata. I have a couple of questions for you as well, of course. And so Care About Climate has just released a new NDC report, correct? Which is putting, very rightfully so, gender and youth very much on the front lines of this report. Could you share some of the key highlights from this, and also your insights on how it could help ramp up adaptation components in NDCs in Africa, but also how these cross-cutting elements are very, very important in these policy instruments, and how they can be turned into action on the ground? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So at Care About Climate, our NDC equity tracker represents 80 countries, and with each region having its own countries. So, and for Africa, we analyzed 15 African countries, including Tunisia, Egypt, Kenya, Lesotho, South Africa, Mauritius, Ghana, Nigeria, and so on. And Africa is the best scoring region because we analyzed how these NDCs are including youth and gender mainstreaming efforts in the implementation and development of NDCs. So some of our findings include, the first one is youth inclusion gap. There is a huge gap in the inclusion of youth in the development and implementation of these NDCs. And 67% of the NDCs analyzed, 67% of the NDCs we analyzed, we discovered that they just only included youth in written, but not in implementation and development. It's just in written. We are just being included in tests, but not in actual implementation and integration. So the second one is a gender integration challenge. There's also like a huge gap in the gender mainstreaming efforts. And a significant number of the NDCs lack meaningful youth involvement, lack the inclusion of gender in the NDC. The only, I think it's just 4 of the NDCs that we analyzed reference gender as a climate indicator, just 4. And about 2/3 of the NDCs we analyzed only reference gender and women in the development and implementation process. So, and the last point that we were able to actually, like, one of our findings was also like, because we had ambassadors, youth ambassadors from all over the world, and these ambassadors also gave their recommendations. And one of the recommendations they gave is that countries with stronger gender and youth inclusion are more likely to have ambitious emissions reduction goals aligned with the Paris Agreement. 100% of our youth ambassadors believe so. So, and some of their recommendations also include the facilitation and the effective, meaningful contribution of young people in developing the NDC through contribution, formal engagement mechanisms such as youth councils, and also university-supported inclusion efforts, and not just only in written, but also in implementation. These are some of the recommendations from our youth ambassadors. The other one is there should be a clear indicators of the impact of climate change on women, and also like to utilize data on gender responsive strategies, because these climate data are not being used. It's just 4 of the NDCs we analyze actually use gender and women climate as climate data indicator. So, and the last one is also invest in the implementation of gender-sensitive approaches to disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. These are some of the recommendations given by our youth ambassadors for the NDCs analyzed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm looking at the time, so I think I will open up the floor to some questions from the audience and also an interactive session, perhaps also between the panelists, if you have questions for each other. I would actually like to start with the question that you had for the audience. Would you like to repeat that again and come on this chair, and I will stand for this section.
Great. So question was around transformative adaptation. What does it mean to you? Noting that we live in a very projectized world, and the danger with projects, of course, is that when they end, and they're not continued. So what would make transformational adaptation? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Shall we first ask someone from the audience what transformative adaptation action means to you? Anyone would dare?
I will try. I think adaptation to climate changes is to, first of all, raising awareness of population about possible problems with climate changes. Secondly, to prepare country, regions, villages for possible disasters and some impacts of climate change to different target groups of population. First of all, raising awareness, prepare some services for quick reaction to climate change, and also to do something to decrease impact to climate change. We need to have temperature not higher than 1.5. So.
Thank you so much. What about one of our panelists about transformative adaptation action in context of your work?
Well, this is not exactly in context of my work, but I like having this debate because this is really one of the new areas. It's a term that is emerging under the UNFCCC process. So if you think about adaptation to a noun, what the global stocktake said was that it's fragmented. It's incremental. It's not, you've been doing, like you mentioned at the beginning there, you said it's project-based, right? But think about the Sahel region of Africa. We have something that is called the Great Green Wall Project. That is transformational. But there are countries and communities within the same belt, the same Sahel belt, who are dealing with the same issues that have to do with desertification and the dryness on a community basis, right? So somebody will come out and try to say, okay, this issue is happening, let me bring in some drought-resilient seeds and things like that. But it's transformational when it has the scale, you take the scale into consideration. It is transformational when you take the temporary, the time-based component into consideration. So if you transform the whole, if the Great Green Wall project actually becomes successful, then you have transformed the whole Sahel belt rather than dealing with this issue on a tiny incremental basis. That's one of the examples that comes to mind at the moment, but I think I have another examples that I can share with you probably on the sidelines. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll take a stab at this as well, and I like it. We talk about this all the time, and I don't think anyone's ever asked me to define it. So I'm gonna try to complement what Walter said and present a slightly different angle. And for us, I think when we talk about transformational, core to that is that it's country-led, and that there's a vision behind it. And so similar, that it's not just piecemeal, but it's really a vision for us at the NDC partnership, really embedded in the NDC, but then importantly also embedded in the country's long-term strategy, their long-term vision, and thinking about what needs to happen to get there, and approaching this from more of a macro angle as opposed to a project angle. That's what I would add.
So just to complement what the two colleagues have said, from my end, I will say, I'll use a synonym. I will simply say innovation. So transformational adaptation is also same as innovation. How can we be innovative? How can we have adaptation strategies that are actually innovative, such as, blended finance, private sector? It's all about, being dynamic, being or having, these strong adaptation components that help us think out of the box. So just be innovative. So for me, transformational is about innovative adaptation strategies, innovative adaptation actions, and not working in silo, but working together, working together as partners, as key stakeholders in order to drive key innovative adaptation strategies. So for me, transformational is innovation.
Thank you, Alice. Any questions from, or any remarks or reflections? Oh, of course.
Okay, transformation for me is inclusivity, and not just including people that we see as being relevant, but also like including vulnerable people as well. Youth are vulnerable to climate change, and also people at the grassroots level. I mean, including them and ensuring their voices are also heard. And also, I think we need to actually for transformational to actually be transformational, we actually need to take into perspective how they will be able to understand the language of NDCs. I mean, how to make all this technical, how to actually make it as simple as possible for them. I mean, for the people at the grassroots level, and how to also welcome their own suggestions. So in the implementation of the new NDCs to be formulated. So that's what transformational means to me. Thank you.
Excellent. Diverse perspectives on transformation. Somebody from the audience? Come on. You know you want to ask a question.
Okay, thanks. My name is Duray Allison. I work for WWF Africa. And my question, I don't know if I call that a question, because what you're saying, I mean, all the panelists, we have the next event we're having would actually start diving into some of the key issues around financing. And we'll be having the AFDB talking about the African Adaptation Benefit Mechanism. But when I listen to you all, and Africa has made adaptation a priority. But then I think Walter was talking that if we look at the number of African countries that have submitted their NAPs, and then, so if you look at those two things, but if it's a priority because it's linked to your development aspiration, why is it that you're not picking that up as a priority and making sure you link that to your development plan? So I don't know, as most African countries now start developing long-term development plans, how are we trying to link not just the adaptation plan, but also the NDCs and the NBSAPs. And I know what, for instance, the African Development Bank has been saying is that we need to look at the NDCs, just like the NABs, just like the NBSAPs, as opportunities for investment to drive development in the continent. So I don't know, it's not a question, but just a remark, and I want to see how you respond either from the NDC partnership, where we have the African NDC Hub from the bank, and even UNEP as well.
Thank you, Duro.
Thank you. Let me just maybe provide an alternative narrative there. And that is that it's not enough to have an app and it's not enough to have an NDC. What you really need to do is to make sure that all of your policies and your fiscal system and your regulations are all speaking to each other. Yeah, let me give you an example. You may know the example of Malawi. You know, Malawi, and it's not the only country on the continent, but it's the country that I've worked in, and therefore I can, you know, say it with confidence. Malawi spends a lot of money on subsidizing inorganic fertilizer. Now, it does it for reasons of food security, fair enough. But what that does is it burns the soils. It leads to land degradation, and eventually it leads to very low agricultural production. So it has the opposite effect. Now, what would it take for Malawi to lift its subsidies on inorganic fertilizer and actually put them on a good or a service that invests in soils? Now, that is a very big re-engineering of their fiscal system, very big. And that, for me, is transformation, because that really takes investments out of a 4-year project into a system-wide scaling. So, you know, there is a lot that needs to be done. And in relation also to the comment around vision, whose vision? You know, ministries of environment are country-led institutions. They have a vision. But is that vision shared by the Ministry of Energy or the Ministry of Agriculture, or for that matter, the Ministry of Finance? You know, so there's a very long way to go, and it's not just an African thing, but because this is focused on Africa, we're talking about Africa, but I mean, this is right across the board. And let me also just raise on agriculture, raise to your awareness, State of Finance for Nature report. It's another flagship that UNEP produces every year. The 2023 report has got some really pointed data on the amount of agricultural subsidies globally versus the amount of funding that goes to ministries of agriculture for planning and budgeting. And it far outstrips what goes to ministries of agriculture. So that there is a huge saving that could be made by repurposing subsidies that are currently degrading resources to something that would really help the country's farmers to adapt to a new climate change world. Thank you.
I mean, I don't have a lot to say on top of that, because I completely agree. And I think that the key point for me is that the NDC and the NAP are two pieces of this puzzle, and none of it can be treated in isolation. And so it's not just that the NDC is the what and the NAP is the how, but taking it further, embedding it into the national development strategy, embedding all of this into the country's investment plans, into their investment pipeline. So I think what's really critical as we think about this year and the next year is how we ensure that that conversation between the development of NDCs, the development of NAPs, and the development of the NBSAPs are linked up. And it goes to your comment on the vision. And that requires leadership at the highest level, but the buy-in from across the different ministries. And I think a key part of what we've seen where that's been most challenging, and this is something I would pose to those in the audience who provide support is how important the evidence base is to be able to make that linkage and to be able to bring those ministries on board towards that common vision.
I just want to thank you very much to you both. Just to quickly compliment I think the comment by the gentleman behind there is the fact that the UN process kind of separates these things is not really, I think it's more for easy comprehension, but these things are really linked, right? Because if you look at the outcome of the Dubai consensus, it does say that any action that is undertaken within the NDC sphere should be an action that enhances the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And by extension, when you go to the Sustainable Development Goals, you're definitely counting biodiversity, NBSAP's therefore features in there, and all the other things. So it's just to say that I fully agree with you. I know it was a comment, but I'm just supporting your point that we have to look at these things in a holistic and more comprehensive manner. And also, even our ministries should not really be looking at these things as if, because increasingly people are even looking at NDCs as development instruments. They are not looking at them as environmental documents or climate change specific documents. They're documents that are actually impacting our ministries of energy. They're transforming our agricultural sector and all of this. So you cannot really continue with this fragmented approach of looking at this is only for climate change. You have to make sure that you see that in addition to that, the mitigation actions that are also being promoted, they say when a mitigation action is one that promotes, that encourages development, those actions are actually seen as more successful. And the Paris Agreement itself, in its overarching chapeau, which then lists the 1.5 degree climate, all of those goals, it clearly says that we are out to address climate change in the context of sustainable development and poverty eradication. And when you talk about biodiversity, addressing biodiversity in the context of NDCs, you are talking about sustainable development. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Excellent responses. Questions, reflection? We have 2 minutes, so I guess no questions or reflections. But please, if anybody wants to say something, no, then I would like to actually challenge you a little bit on the transformative adaptation action, if that's okay. So we work with the scaling, right? Scaling adaptation action, which is, scaling is actually, as you know, is it's an investment word. So scaling financial resources. So we are applying that, okay, we need to scale the solutions for it to have maximum impact, of course. But adaptation, as most of you have mentioned, is a very locally driven work. It is the solutions, the innovation comes from local communities. I'm from Bangladesh. I've seen excellent innovative solutions come from very, very small community members, young people, and so on and so forth. So if adaptation, when we talk about transformative adaptation action, can it also not be extremely local in the context, but may not be scalable because it might not be applicable in a different context?
You're absolutely right. I think there are different scales of scales, right? So we support member states with project implementation, project design, project implementation. So I read through a lot of terminal evaluation reports. And one of the things that really pleases me is when there is evidence that adjacent communities have picked up the practices and are running with it, so-called autonomous adaptation, another bit of jargon. That, to me, makes my day, right? And that is a very localized form of scaling that makes a difference to the people that it affects. So, absolutely, there's different scales, right? So, different scales of scaling, and they are all valid and all needed. Thank you.
So I totally agree with what Dr. Jessica said. And For me, as you said, adaptation is actually locally driven, and one of the criteria actually in this NDC policy paper was to, upscale and give particular attention to locally led adaptation. And my key and last message will be to actually let's innovate together, be it at local, national, regional, or international level. Let's really be innovative, let's be transformative, and together possible in a changing climate.
Maybe since I have the microphone, fully agree with you. I think we have to treat this on a case-by-case basis. There is no one-size-fits-all in the way that I see transformational adaptation. But when I gave the example of the Great Green Wall, I was referring to the fact that you transform a region that used to be a water catchment and the water has dried up. Instead of responding to it with digging wells, for instance, to access water, you basically reclaim that region. And that is just one way of talking about it, right? But I fully agree with you that community-driven transformational adaptation does exist, and there are plenty of examples that we all need to identify, and that is exactly what we're also trying to do at the level of the RCCs, identify some of these good practices and try to showcase them and promote them, give them more visibility. Thank you.
I'll be quick. So again, agree. And I think one of the challenges with adaptation is the fact that the implementation is hyper-local. And so how do you scale that? And I think one of the things we need to keep into account is those lessons and those underlying principles and enablers that are going to help that. To me, that's a key part of transformational.
Okay, yeah. So for me, like I said earlier, I actually believe bottom-up approach is very crucial, and not just top-bottom. And also for my last message, youth inclusivity, just like I mentioned, is very, very important. And also like gender inclusivity as well. Gender mainstreaming efforts and youth inclusivity is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fruitful discussion, and thank you so much for attending the event. I think it was quite wonderful. It was lovely talking and also learning a lot from you. And good luck with the rest of the COP. Thank you so much. We would like a photo of the panel, so if you would stick around.